Fortunately, our good friends at the EU enabled me to make the acquaintance of Tomas Baert. So I'm very pleased to present him to you. We are sticking with our 8 forces reshaping the global economy theme. It just so happens that this one won't tend toward entrepreneurship as much as it will on the hard issue of trade. I'm going to read, unusually for me, Tomas's bio because you don't have him in the program, and I want to make sure you're aware of his background. Tomas Baert is the head of Trade and Agricultural Section at the European Union Delegation to the United States here in DC. Prior to coming here in August 2018, he was head of the Unit for Trade Strategy at the European Communications Directorate General for Trade, where he led the team responsible for the 2015 Trade for All strategy and the 2017 communication on a balanced and progressive trade policy to harness globalization. He also coordinated DG Trade's work on the withdrawal of the UK from the EU and the preparatory discussions on a future EU-UK trade relationship. He thought that deal was going to be done, like many of us, and of course it's still here, but now Tomas has come here to talk to us about many things. First, I'd like to ask, and thank you for such short notice appearing with us. I'd like to understand what a balanced and progressive trade policy that harnesses globalization is.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here, everyone. Good morning. That's a very serious question to start off with, but it's a very serious issue because we feel in Europe as elsewhere that globalization basically has not delivered for everyone. The whole idea was that the rising tide would lift all the boats, and that hasn't really happened. There are, for the lack of a better word, losers or people that are left behind from globalization.
Raise the volume.
Is this better?
There we go.
Okay, I have another go then. I'll speak up. Globalization hasn't delivered for everyone. That was kind of the main observation that we kind of made in Europe as elsewhere. The rising tide did not lift all the boats, basically. There are losers, there are people that are left behind from globalization, and we feel that we need to do a better job in addressing them. And in fact, 2016, which is a very important year by many counts, the year that had an election here in the United States but had a referendum in the United Kingdom, actually showed a lot of that. People feel left behind, and people want to take back control, which was the slogan for the Brexit referendum, in fact. It's not a hollow slogan. It is this genuine feeling that there are forces at work, and I appreciate that is also the themes you're discussing these days. There are these forces at work that we cannot really control and capture, and we need to make sure that as much as trade delivers value and benefits, that it delivers for all, and that is where our Trade for All strategy came from, and the subsequent communication that looks at harnessing globalization and making sure it delivers and it overcomes the challenge of inequality that has been sort of a byproduct of globalization.
Now, the US and the EU are each other's largest trade and investment partners. That will remain the case if there is a Brexit. And the relationship has been largely harmonious and underpinned the liberal international order. But with the Trump administration's arrival, the trade frictions have morphed into what we can basically call a trade war. Could you discuss the key issues? We're right up on a deadline, but could you do a little background on what the tariffs have been put on, why, and how the EU has responded to those?
No, great question. I think the first point I would like to pick up on is to describe a little bit the nature of the relationship, because I think you're quite right in saying we are each other's biggest partners. We're not each other's biggest problem, to be honest. We're a little bit like family. There's a lot of love there, but we tend to push each other's buttons fairly quickly. So 80% of the issues we actually agree on, and we tend to take that for granted. But we tend to focus on the 20%, the issues that are there for a while and that are there for a reason, the fact that we're different. We're quite particular about our food in Europe. We're particular about safety, consumer safety, or food safety standards, for example. And it's important that we find a way to talk to each other and to manage, in a mature relationship, these irritants while making sure that we actually protect and preserve the 80%, the things that go well, the fact that we trade $1 trillion across the Atlantic every year, not because of bureaucrats like me, but because we have people that share values, that share interests, and that have fought wars together, shoulder to shoulder. basically. So that is the nature of our relationship. Now, coming to Washington, and this week, every week, basically, since I've been here, I've been hearing that the EU is not so much a friend, but is more like a foe, that we have not been treating the United States fairly, and that has led to a debate about sort of correcting some of those issues, correcting the trade balance, the trade deficit, and tariffs are one of the main instruments that this president in particular, who's a self-proclaimed tariff man, is using to bring partners to the negotiating table and to get certain concessions from them. So we have tariffs now on our steel and aluminum. I sometimes get this right because we say aluminium in Europe. I'm getting there. And so we have 25% tariffs on steel, 10% tariffs on aluminum because the EU is a national security threat. Now, can you imagine a NATO partner, an ally really, is a national security threat because we sell high-quality steel and aluminum products into the United States. Now, we're at a very particular time because next week we have another deadline on another product, which is cars and car parts, where the administration needs to come to a conclusion on whether or not it wants to impose tariffs on European cars and European car parts. And again, our line hasn't changed. We are a partner. We are not a national security threat. Yes, we do like to sell cars into the United States, like we try to sell them elsewhere, because we tend to think we have good cars. We put German engineers at work with Italian designers, and there's a car that a lot of people like to drive. And those cars are built in Europe, but those cars are also built in the United States. In fact, when you look at it, 29% of the vehicles built in the United States are European, are built by companies of European parentage. So that is how integrated our economies are, and that is the nature of the relationship. So obviously, we are arguing against those tariffs. We don't like tariffs. Tariffs are taxes. I'm sorry to break it. Somebody pays them. Consumers typically tend to pay those tariffs, and so we're hopeful that we can avoid next week that sort of next deadline as we keep working together to really drive up the productivity in the relationship, be positive, and deliver real value and overcome these challenges and these tariffs. So my commissioner for trade, Cecilia Malmström, is very clear. We want to build bridges. We don't want to build walls, including tariff walls.
Very good. I want to come back to the car question in 1 second, but when you mentioned that the U.S. determined that the EU posed a national security threat, D.C., Washington put tariffs on other countries too at the time, Canada, Japan, Korea, and so forth, and gave some exemptions. Why didn't the EU get an exemption?
Well, that's a very good question, and I would actually ask the question also to the administration. I would point out that you're quite right. A number of countries have been labeled a national security threat, and that includes neighbors like Canada and Mexico. Now, both of these countries have been a part of a negotiation of a new NAFTA, new North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called the USMCA, the US-Canada-Mexico Agreement. And it's quite curious because as this agreement was concluded, there's nothing there on steel or on aluminum that takes away this alleged national security threat. So there's no specific fix other than a sort of basic monitoring mechanism to make sure that we're clear about which steel is coming in from where and that there's no circumvention through China, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. So it's quite peculiar, and it's the same for the cars story, that we are labeled a national security threat.
On cars as well.
On cars as well, but subsequently, there is no national security fix. So there's a problem in cars, but the solution doesn't seem to be cars, just like on steel and aluminum. And so we're scratching our heads, wondering what it is that we can do, and I can only guess that in the case of Canada and Mexico, certain concessions were offered as part of this new trade agreement, the USMCA, in other areas, including in agriculture, for example, and that the administration is using this instrument of Section 232, which is this national security-based investigations on imports, that it is using it to squeeze us, to really get concessions out of us in other areas that are not related to the actual industries that are being investigated. It's the same thing for Japan. Japan has been subject to tariffs on steel and aluminum, have been threatened with tariffs on cars, and Japanese and the American administration, the US administration, has concluded a trade deal, but curiously, there's no fix there on cars. There's nothing that was done on cars in terms of limiting car trade or boosting investment in the United States. So I would submit that cars are identified as a problem, but cars don't seem to be the solution here.
Well, the surplus is what, EU surplus, US deficit is what irritates Donald Trump. He sees it as a zero-sum experience. And I think the figures that I saw were for January to August this year, the US is running about $147 billion deficit with the EU, which is up over 11% from the same period last year. What percentage of that is car trade?
So cars is significant. It's about 40% of our overall trade, two-way trade. But I would just pick up on the point on the trade deficit, because we are looking here at a very specific parameter. And I take it that this president and this administration considers the trade deficit to be the barometer that speaks to the health of a trade relationship. But we don't agree with that. Sorry to break it, but we build good cars. And I think the president is quite clear about that. He's quite aware of it. He likes European cars himself. He has several. And he knows that it is a question of consumer preferences. As a businessman, he realizes that it's consumers that choose the particular cars. I'm going to be very careful here, but I don't want to offend anyone, but we don't like pickup trucks in Europe.
You don't like?
We don't like pickup trucks.
Oh, yeah.
Right? 1/3 of the market in the United States are pickup trucks. These are cars.
They're hard to park.
That you cannot fit on our roads, that you cannot fill up with our paychecks, typically, given the fuel efficiency standards. I'm sure they're a lot of fun. But this is a North American market. Almost nobody outside of North America drives pickup trucks. So if you want to trade more, you want to build a product that people like, be it a small Japanese car or a sexy European car. Again, those Italian engineers or designers are at work. And that is just what is happening here. So we have a lot of cars that are being traded. We have a lot of cars that are being built in the United States, as already mentioned. BMW is the biggest exporter of cars to China from the United States. 80,000 vehicles were sent from Spartanburg, South Carolina to China last year. And Daimler is a close second with Mercedes. So we're building good cars, and so it would be wrong to evaluate and to look at our relationship just through that lens of the trade deficit on cars.
Sure.
We love a lot of European products. All the digital services that we're importing these days, be it Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, are American. And so if you take the full picture of the trade balance, which not only comprises goods, not only comprises cars, but also services and capital flows, you'll actually see that the trade balance is in U.S. favor.
Services, yes. They are, yeah.
Services,
sure.
but I can give you plenty of examples, and goods even at the sort of individual sectoral level where we import more than we export. You need to appreciate the full relationship. We are happy to send you our great cars, but we buy other products back. And that's the broader relationship, which is a balanced one, and trade is really a two-way street.
Yeah. I'm going to just stick with cars for a second longer. The tariffs on trucks, I think the U.S. imposes 25%.
Correct.
And EU is actually lower, 22%. And
10%.
10%.
10%.
Pardon me. But the car tariffs are higher.
Yeah, so we have a 10% tariff on all vehicles.
All vehicles.
Whereas
And
in the United
US is
States,
2.5%.
there's a 2.5% tariff on passenger vehicles, and there's a 25% tariff on trucks, including those infamous pickup trucks. Now, that is something we don't like tariffs. I already mentioned it. So I think we're very happy to negotiate a way to reduce our tariffs, to reduce the 10% to zero. And that, in fact, is what we do with all our negotiating partners. The EU has now agreements in place with 72 countries around the world. And we are concluding deals we have deals with Japan, with Canada, with Mercosur, which brings together Brazil, Argentina, and others in Latin America. And that is what we're doing. Our economy is like a parachute. It basically works best when it's open. You need to be open to ideas, to innovation, to people, to capital, to goods, to services. And so that is something we're looking to negotiate and to consolidate also in the context of a bilateral trade relationship. So our commissioner, my boss has been very clear. We're happy to liberalize those car tariffs. We're happy to get rid of the 10%. But again, that takes place in a bigger context.
The administration is talking about hiking it to 25% on European cars, which would be about 10 or 11,000 per vehicle, which would be hugely stressful on Europe's economy.
Honestly, Bill, I think that is, and I careful with my words here, but that would be a nuclear weapon. I think the first thing we need to appreciate about nuclear weapons is they're far more effective as an instrument of deterrence than as an instrument you actually want to use. Because when you drop such weapons, when you use them, you basically kill the conversation. You might even kill and ruin the relationship. At that point, we are not even talking to each other anymore. We will have to react, just like we've done on steel. And the effect is eventually felt mostly domestically. No one here in the United States, that I speak to at least, is in favor of car tariffs. The car dealers aren't, the manufacturers aren't, the consumers certainly aren't. So I think we need to be very, very careful in going to those kind of instruments of last resort. So we're very hopeful that we can avoid car tariffs, that we can keep working together, that we can keep the conversation going, and that we can even reduce those tariffs rather than increasing them.
Well, our Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, who's not in charge of trade policy, was speaking at the German ambassador's residence on German National Day in early October. And he concluded a very nice speech about the bilateral relationship, saying, "What a beautiful, shiny red Mercedes you have on your lawn. I want one." So is it a negotiating tactic? Would everybody be happy if the U.S. went up to just 10% to match you? Or what are the chances that next week you can get a deal? Well, 10%, 10%, or 0-0?
Well, I think first we need to be very clear about what problem it is that we're solving here, because I think there's a flawed understanding that goes back to this idea that there is an unbalanced trade relationship. If we are going to cut tariffs on the European side from 10% to 0%, and the US is going to do the same, what is going to be the end result? You're going to have more cars, more European cars in the United States, because it is a good product. I'm sorry to say so again. So that is what the trade deficit will look like. And I think the president, when there was one of the sites up north was closed, he said, "Well, build a better car." I'm sorry, the Chevrolet Cruze is not a sexy car. The president said that himself. I mean, this is not me speaking here. Yes, I am trying to get people into BMWs and other cars, but I mean, we basically need to make sure that there's a level playing field and that our economy is open and that we can consolidate that openness. But that means, in the case of cars, that you're going to have more European cars in the United States if we liberalize that. If you're going to increase those tariffs to 10 or 25%, again, somebody's going to pay that bill, and that's going to be consumers, it's going to be car dealers, it's going to be people in the United States.
Broadening it out a little bit, I think the European Commission said overnight that Eurozone growth is now likely to decline. They've revised their forecast for 2019 from 1.2% to 1.1%, and for 2020, 1.5% to 1.2%. Is it trade? Is it trade prospects? Or what's going on? You alluded to the impact that this has on investment decisions, consumer decisions. How much?
Absolutely, it's a huge role, and I wouldn't use the word trade necessarily. I would use the word uncertainty, because the problem that we see today with some of the disruption that has been created in the trading environment is that there's uncertainty for businesses when it comes to investment decisions, when it comes to trade decisions. And our sense is that business can deal with complexity, but business cannot deal very well with uncertainty. And so we're trying to take away that uncertainty that is not only due to trade and to some of the policies that are being proposed here in the United States. We have another issue, which I think we'll also probably talk about, which is called Brexit.
Airbus. Oh, Brexit. We'll get to there too.
We can talk about Boeing too. But so there's uncertainty, and that is something that markets are not very good with. But we see positive growth. Our numbers are not as impressive as the ones here on the U.S. side. Our economy is structured and organized in a very different way, but we still see positive numbers moving forward.
To close out the tariff talk, the WTO ruled in favor of the U.S. that Airbus has been receiving unfair subsidies, and this is a dispute that's gone on for 14 years. And as a result of that, I think it precipitated $7 billion in $7.5 billion in tariffs. Will the EU retaliate on that, or do you wait for your case, which is that Boeing has been doing a similar kind of subsidizing, or can this be negotiated away?
Exactly right. We have lost our case, and we're very clear and open about that. But we have also won a case. We have won our case against Boeing as we have lost our case against Airbus. And so our point is, rather than, again, shooting at each other
and this was
with retaliatory tariffs, exactly. And so the Boeing case will be fully concluded in April next year. But rather than reaching again for some of the weapons that we can use, and rather than weaponizing trade as some like to do it, we want to talk. I mean, this is a unique and a complex sector. Aviation needs some form of support to build new models and new aircraft. So what we propose to do is to actually come together and to agree what it is that we can accept both sides as form of support to support this unique, complex industry, and what are the subsidies that we agree to remove. In the case of, I don't want to get too technical here, but on our side, in the case for Airbus, the instrument that we're using is what is called repayable launch aid. So this is a loan that some of our member states, 4 member states are part of an Airbus consortium, that they give to Airbus. And Airbus has to repay it, but the terms of the loan are actually more beneficial, more interesting than market rates. And so what we have already done, 2 of our member states have adjusted the terms of that aid. 2 still need to do that, and one of the programs for the A380 plane, the big plane that people will know, that plane the program has been discontinued. So I think we're on track to complying, but we also want to have that conversation really about how can we support this industry that is really in need of some support. And I think both sides, both stories show that. We just happen to be, again, slightly different about how we go about, how we support that industry. And so settling is what we want to do. Out of court, this has been going on for too long. It's 15 years of fighting and of arguing over civil aircraft. And I think now is the time. Now, unfortunately, we see, again, that tariffs are being introduced on a lot of products, including products that have nothing to do with the aviation industry. We're talking about cheeses and wines and olive oils from several of the EU's member states. And we think that's unfortunate. So we're really looking to settle. That's not something we've been saying for the last weeks. That's something we've been saying for the last years, if I can be honest. But we're hopeful that as the other dispute on Boeing is coming to a conclusion, that we will be able to set the standard and not just do that in a way that we regulate the issues and solve the issues between us, but that we can also project our standard and our interests to others in the world economy. And again, China comes to mind. Yeah. There are other entrants on the market, and we want to make sure that we use our relationship really to set the standard and to project that standard.
Before we turn to China, is there any good news on trade, or is it all bad right now? Have we lost the thread of liberalization and
there's a lot of good news, to be honest. I mean, I appreciate trade liberalization is like peeling an onion. It's an activity that makes you cry, but it's also something that really makes you work through different layers, and we are doing that. And we're very deep in the onion in the EU-US relationship, really. Yeah. Because we're not talking about border issues. I mean, we talk about tariffs, but our average tariffs on both sides are less than 5%. So that's really nothing. Even if we're happy to remove them, that's not the biggest issue in our relationship. We're really firmly looking behind the border at some of the regulatory differences, and we're doing good work there. The problem with that work is, and I'm happy to talk about it more, but it's not tweetable. It's very hard to explain how we are expanding our mutual recognition agreement on good manufacturing practices in the pharmaceutical industry to veterinary medical products. I probably lost all of you. I mean, those are the kinds of things we're working on. Making sure that when you have a car, to come back to that example and to make it a little bit more tangible.
You've just reminded me of my reporting in Asia on mango trade, which is just really as niche as it gets.
I'd love to hear more about that maybe later. But
maybe not.
but we don't have mangoes in our trade relationship. We used to have bananas, but that is also solved. But we have a lot of very sophisticated things there that we need to deal with. And I would really come back to the more political point there. What we're trying to do here is not just create value and be productive in the transatlantic relationship. We really want to set the standard. I mean, China and Japan have just agreed on new standards for the plugs for e-vehicles. That is the kind of thing that we should be doing together. And that is maybe one of the reasons you don't hear as much about it, because it's complex, it's technical, but that is the trade that we're talking about. It's not the tariffs, it's the behind the border issues.
Was there relief in Brussels with the phase 1, quote, deal of US-China? Or is is it seen as the U.S.-China trade war has sucked all the attention away from what will happen next week?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's relief. I think there's a lot of concern in Brussels, because this is an issue on which the EU and the US basically agree. There is a too large public footprint on private markets in China. And we have huge issues with IP theft, intellectual property rights, we have tech transfer issues, we have investment and trade restrictions, and so we share the diagnosis with the United States. The question is, what is the remedy? What we're seeing is that China basically has been caught for speeding. And the Chinese want to pay the ticket and they want to keep driving. But we fundamentally want to change the driving style. It is about the structural issues, as some call it here in Washington. And so we share that analysis. The problem is that some here in Washington are quite transactional about China, and others are more transformational about China. The transactionists want a nice deal probably for political gain and want to announce that soybeans are being purchased and other products are now being traded again. But fundamentally, we need to look at those structural issues. And this deal needs to be transformational. It needs to look at the behavioral changes. So when I say that we are concerned in Europe, it is that we are concerned because we might not get to those structural issues. And we certainly know on our side that we can't get to them alone. So this is a strategic challenge that we need to be aligning ourselves on. And so we want to work together. That doesn't mean we have to be in the same room. That doesn't mean we have to speak the same language necessarily, but we fundamentally need to work together. And I think that is where our concern comes from. But we're obviously hopeful that as deals get struck, and this is a phase one, I note, that some of that uncertainty in the trading system is going to be removed, and that we get back to a more certain trading environment, a rules-based trading environment, with more predictability for our businesses and our citizens.
Who's got the upper hand in this, the transactionalists or the transformationalists?
Well, I would submit that right now the transactionalists are winning. I mean, the phase one deal is a transactional deal. It's not a transformational deal. So I don't think we will see those behavioral changes, and let's not be naive. We will never get such a deal in 90 days or in a longer period of time. I was previously posted in Geneva, Switzerland, the home of watchmaking, and the Chinese like to come to Geneva to buy watches, and then they would say, well, you guys have watches, but we have time. And I think that is a fundamental notion in Chinese thinking. Yeah. Time in the Western world is a linear concept. It's a circular idea in China. And so I think the Chinese are playing this long. They don't have the elections or other things to worry about. So fundamentally, I don't think the transformationalists are on the upper hand, and I think going into election year, it will be very difficult to actually deal with those transformational issues with China. As much as we share that interest with the United States, and as much as we're looking forward to further cooperation.
I'm wanting to ask my team, if they're out there, to bring microphones to the floor so we can engage you in this conversation. French President Macron is in China for a 2-day visit this week, and I think the incoming EU Trade Commissioner, Phil Hogan, is with him. The German delegation is part of that, which is that a common united front that we see now these days for the EU to be included with member states in pressing China to open up markets and...
Well, I would say it's quite common. I mean, maybe I could be slightly more philosophical about it. Our motto in Europe is that we are united in diversity. So yes, you see a lot of diversity, but I think Americans do generally think about Europe as being very diverse, but they underestimate how united we are. And by the way, Europeans think of America as being very united, but we underestimate how diverse you are. So I think, yes, you need to appreciate when you look at the EU politics that there is a lot of diversity there. There's lots of voices there, but ultimately we're all working in the same direction. And in particular in the area of trade and economic policy, we speak with a single voice, which means that we deliver in Shanghai this week a new agreement on the protection of the products that we like so much. Geographical indications are products like champagne and cognac and some of the cheeses and meat products that we have. So we are working with the Chinese. We're getting some of those results. And in fact, we're getting those results without having to put on tariffs and without hurting our consumers.
And they're not copying Greek feta cheese in China. They're not,
Well,
these are...
they shouldn't now. I mean, that precisely being the point. You are not allowed to put on Greek goddesses and temples and all kinds of things and call your product feta if it doesn't come from Greece and is produced in line with certain standards. So that is an example, and I know not every cheese producer in Wisconsin likes us for that, but that is how we are projecting our standards and how we are taking forward our interests around the world as we see the United States in retreat, honestly, because we don't see a lot of new trade deals being concluded, at least not the transformational, comprehensive deals that we are looking to conclude around the world.
Would you say in the diversity among the member states that attitudes are, I would say American attitudes in government towards China, maybe not at the people level, but in government anyway, it's pretty unified. Both parties are seeing the threat and advocating strong trade policies. Is that same thing happening in Europe?
No, I absolutely
Does Germany
think so.
have a different view than France or Italy?
Well, Germany and France regularly have different views, but I think the key message here is that we are in Europe very serious about China more generally. I think Americans may not have seen that as much, but the China politics has changed a lot in Europe. In Paris, in Berlin, we're having the huge debate on 5G and on a certain supplier of the next generation of telecom networks.
Named.
Yeah, I don't speak Chinese. You don't speak Chinese. No, we're not after one particular supplier, to be clear, but there are concerns with Huawei. I mean, that is very, very clear. And so when you look at some of the positions that we've taken at the Commission level, the European Commission level, at the industry level, you'll see that we're very serious about it. And there is something like a multi-partisan support on that. China, we've labeled China a strategic rival and a systemic competitor. Mm-hmm. It's not just about trading with China and sending more containers. We want to send our values to China also, and I think that is another area in which we want to work more with the United States, as we have in the past and as we keep doing right now.
Very well. Please come up to the mics if you have questions.
This is where the pickup owners come out. And
Joe McKinney from the Dallas-Fort Worth Council. I notice you have worked on Brexit, and I wonder how you think Brexit, if and when it occurs, will affect the U.S.-EU relationship and also the EU-UK relationship, trading relationship.
Well, that is a great question, and of course, with good questions, there are no good or simple answers. I'm okay taking this immediately, or you want to?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's do one at a time.
No, first of all, I think it's important to repeat that Brexit is something, it's a choice that the British people have made, and it's a choice that we in the European Union respect. We don't necessarily like it. We're losing a family member, but we obviously need to accept that, and we have been working hard to a withdrawal agreement and a political declaration on a future relationship that keeps Britain close to us. It will always be a neighbor, of course. I think that is the first thing to remember, that there is such a thing, and economists even put that in their models, which is called gravity. I mean, the UK is close to us. It trades about half of all its products, goods and services with the European Union, the 27 member states, and so it's critical that we are able to have this new relationship with the UK, which will be in principle a relationship based on a free trade agreement. I mean, British people have made a decision. They want to take back control. They don't want to contribute to the EU budget. They don't want to be part of our decision making. They want an independent and autonomous trade policy. So with those red lines, you end up with a free trade agreement. But as they take back control, that also means we effectively allow the UK to negotiate a trade relationship with the United States. And that is something on which I can't say much really, because that's, again, a choice that the British people will have to make on whether or not they want to live up or comply to certain sanitary standards, for example, on food safety, be it on GMOs, genetically modified organisms, or on chlorinated chicken, just to name some of the very contentious issues that we have had in the transatlantic trade relationship. But that is ultimately a choice that the UK has to make. And I've seen there's been a lot of debate about whether or not the European Union, including through the withdrawal agreement, will constrain the UK in pursuing an independent trade policy. I can only say that as they leave the Union, they will be free to conclude a trade agreement. And as much as the US is our close ally and our close partner, we have very strong and serious trade negotiations with them, and I'm sure that will be the same with the UK. So I don't expect that to be easy, and I don't expect that to be done in a short period of time. But that is their experience, that is their choice, and that is something we will not be a part of, and we will not comment on too much, to be honest.
Very good. Over here.
Yes, my name is Ed Martins. I'm from World Boston. I'd like to go back to your comment about values and how much you think trade can be involved in exporting values too, and it's a tough call. I think about the NBA, for example. And if an industry says, okay, we won't sell this to China because of their policies, it will obviously hurt them. China's a humongous market. And how much governments can be involved in that and things like that, where governments getting involved in industry and values and that sort of thing.
Well, it's a great point, and this is a challenge that we face ourselves in Europe. We are a key champion of the Paris Agreement on climate, for example, and our member states have made it a precondition for the European Commission to engage in trade negotiations to only do that with countries that have actually ratified the Paris Agreement, and I believe there's one that hasn't done that. So values, be it environmental, labor, or broader societal values, is a critical sort of product in a way that we're trying to put in those containers into that trade that we're exporting, and that's a difficult balancing act. But our trade agreements overall, much like the USMCA, include chapters that will promote sustainable development, that will not only look at what the product is, but how that product has been made. And that is something we will see more developments on as we are in Europe now working towards a European Green Deal. The new Commission has announced this as one of its priorities, as part of which we will see proposals, for example, on a carbon tax. So huge challenge, something on which I think we've already done a lot, and more is certainly to come as we try to export our values and try to align ourselves with our partners and allies to do more in this space.
Very good.
Good morning. Or can you hear me? All right, good morning. You mentioned that you only wanted to lower tariffs if the U.S. lowers tariffs, and I know Friedman was a proponent that a country's welfare is equal to its imports minus its exports, and that if you lower tariffs, that your imports would increase, therefore increasing your welfare. Would you agree or disagree with this point of view? Thank you.
No, I mean, this is economics 101. I mean, tariffs, again, hurts your own economy. It hurts your consumers. And so the best thing in welfare economic terms is to get rid of all tariffs and all restrictions. It so happens that we live in a political world where you don't do those things for free, but politicians rather choose to liberalize and lower tariffs in exchange for somebody else lowering their tariffs. And that game has been going on for a while, and I think we've been pretty successful on the European side in playing it in the sense that we have those deals with 72 countries around the world. We trade under, and this is a little bit technical maybe, but under the WTO rules, which are called Most Favored Nation, Article 1 of the GATT, with less than 25 countries. By the way, that's an important Brexit point. Brexiteers keep saying, oh, we can take WTO rules, that's fine. What is good enough for the rest of the world is good enough for us. But what is the rule is actually the exception. So we don't trade with a lot of countries under our standard tariff because we liberalize them so much. So I definitely agree with your basic proposition there. It so happens that I live in and I work in a political economy that requires us to insist that we lower our own tariffs in exchange for somebody else. Doing that, which is a broader negotiation of give and take, of course, and that takes a little bit of time.
Please.
I'm Marietta Velikova. I'm with Tennessee World Affairs Council. So I couldn't agree more with your approach to have a transformational deal with regard to China. But today, do you think it's even possible? Because our assumption was that by engaging China as a member of WTO, we'll be able to share values, to share the values that we stand on, like human rights, freedom, etc. So today, China is much stronger than it was back then. And if we look at our interaction or relationship with China, I feel like in many ways we have been very transactional with China. Intellectual property rights violation, technology theft, they've been going on. And no matter what, we need that access to the market, to increasing middle class in China. So I think China has figured it out, and today they didn't just became more authoritarian, but they started to export these ideas, this system, and these values, and this ideology. So how can we expect or hope transformational deal and change China's behavior when we, in some ways, behave in a very transactional way as well?
Well, I would agree with you. We have been very transactional with China, and I think you see that today. And I don't want to suggest that what President Macron is doing in Shanghai this week is completely transformational. I think to be transformational, we need to be aligned, we need to have a clear sense of direction, and we need a clear strategy. I think there's a lot of tactics on China often, but there's not a lot of strategy. And in a way, there's too many strategies. Because one of the fundamental problems we face today is that there's a lot of people here in Washington that want to divorce from China. And that is not something that we necessarily would agree with. We need those supply chains. We use those supply chains. 90% of the growth in the world in the next 10 to 15 years is going to come from outside of Europe. And so we're very clear that we want to connect to those growth centers. We want to go where the growth is. And so we want to use those supply chains. And that means we're not looking at divorcing or at disrupting in that particular China context, at least. So I think we need to work together. I don't want to sound naive on having any quick fixes on having China do this transformation. But arguably, we have already gone through various phases. We have had China join the World Trade Organization in November 2001, at which point they have pursued a lot of domestic reforms. It so happens that we haven't seen the follow-up to those reforms. So I think we're at the stage where we need, I can say it in that way, almost like a second WTO accession, a second bite at the cherry, but one where China is sitting at the table, one where we are aligned with our allies on bringing about that transformation, on changing the driving style, to go back to my car metaphor there. And that takes time, but that takes also strategic vision, and every once in a while you'll see someone be very transactional about China. I think that's the nature of politics, essentially. But we need a bigger game there, and I think that's one on which we hope to work together with the United States.
And by the way, companies have to be transactional. These tariffs are forcing European companies, American companies to relocate their supply chains in Vietnam, India, and so forth.
Absolutely.
And that's hugely expensive and uncertain in terms of the delivery.
Yeah, but we are squeezing a balloon here, right? When you squeeze a balloon, it pops up somewhere else. And so when you squeeze China, you see the export numbers and the investment decisions that are being made in Vietnam right now completely on the rise. So we need to be a little bit more strategic about this here and not so focused on the short term. But we definitely don't want to disrupt supply chains or divorce from China in the way that some here in the United States propose that. But again, we do share the diagnosis. It's all about how do we deal with China, how do we go about in addressing these challenges. Sir.
So you advocated a lot about like, open markets within the EU and the importance of the U.S. and the EU bilateral trade. Do you think that the EU should begin to open its markets wider to the U.S. agriculture, which is considered a lot more effective?
Well, first of all, we are the biggest importer and exporter of agricultural products. Right? We have a lot of great products that we like to export, and I've named some of them. They're typically high-value, low-volume products, champagne, wines, cheeses, etc. We tend to import a lot of the high-volume but lower-value products. We don't produce as many commodities as, for example, the United States produces. We don't produce soybeans in Europe. Which is one of the reasons why we have also a trade surplus actually on our side in the field of agriculture, because it just takes fewer containers to ship our whiskeys here than the amount of the number of vessels we need to import those soybeans. Now, your point is well taken in that there are certain agricultural interests on the U.S. side that we're very aware of in our market, especially in some of the higher-end meat products, and we have increased, for example, a quota for non-hormone beef in imports into Europe, just like on poultry and on pork. There is an interest in seeing more openness to our markets. We actually negotiate a full opening to our markets and some of the entry conditions as part of broader deals. And I think that is something we have tried to do with the United States. We've tried to do that through what was known as the TTIP, or TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and it didn't quite work. I mean, there were a lot of issues to look at. We had a change in leadership on the US side, and right now we're trying to actually do doable deals. We try to see what can we do. I mean, we are ready to liberalize all our tariffs on the industrial side first. That includes fishery products. But on agriculture, it's a very sensitive question for us right now. So we're not ready to do that. But we speak a lot about the trade deficit here. Trade negotiations require trust, really, and relationship move at the speed of trust. So I sometimes think that we have a little bit of a trust deficit rather than a trade deficit here, and we need to work on that. So what I want to do is to really have a bit of a snowball effect where we start small with results that are positive and that really matter, and that can then snowball into something bigger and better down the road. So I'm sure we're very well aware of the US interest in certain segments of our agricultural market. I think we will be talking about that at some point down the road. But right now, we do not have the mandate to do that, and we rather look to do doable deals that can really bring back that trust in the relationship and that can help us deal with some of the bigger challenges down the road.
Thank you.
All right, Mary Mendoza, World Boston. Let's say Brexit actually becomes a thing and Boris Johnson gets what he wants. And Scotland breaks away from the United Kingdom, Wales breaks away, and Northern Ireland joins with Ireland. And the Catalans actually decide to get away from Spain. Would you accept all of those new countries as members of the EU?
Well,
You're in charge, right?
yes. My spokesperson always advises me not to answer hypothetical questions, so I think there's quite a few hypotheses there. No, I mean, we are not in a situation right now where we can consider sort of applications from others to the European Union. We obviously wish our UK friends and colleagues the best in a post EU or post Brexit environment, and it's not really for me to comment on what may happen to the union that the United Kingdom has. I think we'll be focusing on our own union, on making sure that it's strong. We have 27 member states. There are others knocking on our door, and in fact, this administration is encouraging us as much as we're being told that the union is a foe. We're being asked to take on North Macedonia and Albania and others in the Western Balkans. So I think there's a great success there of our union, the one of 27. That's the one we'll be focusing on. And we wish all the best to other unions out there that we'll try to keep close for sure in a different kind of context. But it's not for us to say much on how they will run their household.
Very good. Let's take this question.
Hi, Bob Erbstein from the Naples Council on World Affairs. You're sitting next to a banner which says 8 forces reshaping the global economy.
Yes, sir.
And I'm having trouble understanding what these 8 forces are and how they relate to this discussion. The second part of it, and it relates to that, is basically trade is a capitalist concept in terms of what's going on. And the negotiations which are going on, when you bring in the issue of values, you're bringing in the question of social engineering at the same time. And it seems like this issue of social engineering, which is different in each of the countries, trying to pull them together with a capitalist system of trade is a fundamental dilemma. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that and somehow tie it into this issue of the 8 forces reshaping the global economy.
I'll certainly answer that, but if you want to go first, or do you want to?
Well, I'm not sure how to approach that one, because I would take some issue with the fundamental premise that trade would be a capitalist construct somehow. I mean, trade has always been there. It was barter trade in the beginning, right. and we've seen a lot of trade in communist environments. So trade is this fundamental sort of exchange or interaction that societies have had from the earliest of days. It so happens that trade has become a pinnacle of our capitalist approach and our capitalist economies, where we let capital and labor go to its most productive sources and destinations, and that we do organize that in a macroeconomic context where we can maximize those gains, including through supply chains. I'm not sure I see an issue there with the question on values and using values as one of the things we want to export, really. So trade is never a means in itself, or never an end in itself, rather. It is a means to an end. That is how we look at it. So I have some doubts there with some of the basic premise that we're using this and seeing this exclusively as a tool of capitalism in our society. But the 8 forces,
the 8 forces, you don't even know what they are. I'm not sure I know what they are, but no, that's not true. So we had tried to position Secretary Baker to talk about changes in economic statecraft. He chose a different angle for us, so we were absent a force from him, generally speaking. But last night, AI and how we will learn, work, and live a dignified life is certainly a force that's coming. Trade has produced, freer trade over the past decades has produced enormous prosperity for people around the world. And the question is, if we are entering a protectionist era, to what extent, we're seeing Germany at 0.1% growth, on average, quarter by quarter. What happens in trade policy is absolutely going to affect the global economy, and we haven't even touched on the WTO and its very iffy future. Coming up after this session, we'll have Sarah Chen on the she economy, how women are becoming a greater force in entrepreneurship, venture capital, philanthropy. We have folks from the Business Roundtable and Aspen Institute to discuss the corporation and the BRT's new statement on the role of the corporation, which has been seen as a maximizing shareholder value, and now it's maybe morphing into something else, and how that affects the very essence of capitalism. At lunch, we're going to pick up a lot on the China strategy with former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. China is the #1 force moving the world economy these days, and we'll hear a lot about infrastructure investment. In the afternoon, climate change, which has many, many impacts, from food insecurity, which we'll touch on in depth, but also migration, how cities are planning, moving, building. And finally, the economics of disinformation wraps it up, and how big tech is a force in our lives for better and for worse. What that means for privacy issues, what that means for media, and how our polities produce and consume news. And lastly, we're really delighted that Ralph Fuchs, who is a Green from Germany, will talk about his book and whether it's similar to this topic. As you said, our values as open societies are under threat by illiberal forces of populism and economic nationalism. And what are we going to do about it? If we descend into illiberalism, we're going to face a completely different world economy. So those are the 8 forces, folks. Sir.
There is a growing movement, or I'd say a growing populist movement in Europe. I mean, we've seen it in Italy, we've seen it in the UK, especially in terms of Brexit. It's ongoing, and Eastern Europe as well. How concerned is the European Union about this, and what are their plans to try to contain it so that it doesn't get out of control?
Well, it's a great question, and then I have to go a little bit outside of my trade kind of hat here. But we are, of course, very concerned. It goes back to your own point that we are societies that are built on openness and that are really trying to consolidate that openness, not having borders for people, for ideas, for goods, capital, and services, of course. And so we have made part of our founding treaties some of the very values that we just talked about, and we are trying to make all our member states uphold them, including where there are issues with the rule of law, for example, in some member states in Central and Eastern Europe that are part of the European Union. So there's been a very strong approach from the European Commission side to really uphold those high standards and to have everyone in our family live up to them. So there's been a lot of concerns, as much as we also need to appreciate that there's a lot of diversity, and that we need to, of course, let our member states manage their own shop and their own domestic political environment there. So it's a huge issue in Europe as it is elsewhere. We have a whole range of initiatives from big to small, from some of the specific questions on rule of law and upholding those standards, to new campaigns and new instruments to deal with misinformation, really, because there's a lot of problems in the digital context in particular with misinformation and or disinformation rather. And so those are some of the things that we deal with. But we have a whole sort of area of policies looking at that. Yeah.
Not to get too hypothetical, but if a leading Democrat were to ascend to the White House in 2020, would it be, do you think, a different approach to the EU other than maybe semantically?
Well, we would hope so. I think one of the messages that we hear a lot here on Capitol Hill in particular is that, take China again, people have or trade more generally, people have a lot of understanding for the diagnosis, for the problems, and for the challenges that China or trade may bring. But the fundamental component, or the fundamental idea that we're trying to have changed, and that we are picking up quite a lot, is that to address those challenges, you really need to work with your allies and with your partners. We didn't speak too much about the WTO, but it's a good example of an area where we really need to come together. We have learned from Americans that if it ain't broken, don't fix it. But this is broken, and so we need to fix it. And
we need
to come together.
Judges there.
Exactly. So we need to fix that problem. And so we may come from different places when it comes to the definition of the problem or how we look at it. But we really need to come together. And so the change that we're hoping for, irrespective of the party or the president that is there, is a fundamental appreciation for the fact that we are partners. We are partners that share values, that share interests, and our prosperity and our security fundamentally depends on each other. And so we need each other a lot. We support each other, and I think that is how we want to move forward as we look at the world and some of the forces. I mean, I heard AI, artificial intelligence is a huge issue, for example. That is how we look at the world, and that is the kind of change that we're hoping to hear also coming out of the White House.
It is the future. Tomas Baert, Head of Trade and Agriculture at the EU delegation.